Welcome to this explainer on Whitechapel, c1870 to 1900, crime, policing, and the inner city. And we are jumping straight in. Here is our ultra-efficient GCSE revision agenda. Local context, inhabitants, policing organization, investigative policing, national context, and working with sources. Let's get to it. Section 1. The local context of Whitechapel. All right, picture London in the 1870s. It's literally the largest city on Earth, but Whitechapel sits right on its severely deprived eastern edge, where a booming population has completely outpaced the available housing. On Charles Booth's famous poverty map from 1889, we uncover a pretty staggering statistic. Around a third of East Enders lived in absolute poverty. Look at the map. You can see how the red, middle-class streets sit literally back-to-back with the black streets. Booth labeled those black areas as the lowest class, vicious, semi-criminal. Now, for your exam, the absolute crucial takeaway here is this. Poverty didn't just happen to exist alongside crime. It directly created the conditions for crime to thrive. So all this extreme overcrowding created what were known as rookeries. These were dense, filthy, maze-like courts and alleys where entire families were crammed into a single, unventilated room. Now, there were some attempts to fix this, right? Most notably, the Peabody Estate, which was funded by an American philanthropist named George Peabody in 1881. It actually offered modern flats with real ventilation and shared bathrooms. It was a huge step up. But, and this is a key limitation to remember, the Peabody Estate was a highly localized improvement. The poorest residents still couldn't afford the rent there, which meant that slum clearance ultimately just displaced the poverty into the next street over. And for those who couldn't even afford a room in a slum, well, there was the workhouse. The Victorians operated on a really strict policy called less eligibility. Basically, this dictated that conditions inside a workhouse had to be deliberately worse than the worst paid job on the outside. The idea was to ensure only the truly desperate would ever go in. These incredibly harsh conditions, combined with the severe overcrowding everywhere else, effectively destroyed any sense of community ties. Think about it. When you have absolutely zero stability and no privacy whatsoever, crime just becomes an inevitable survival mechanism, and that makes policing incredibly difficult. Which brings us to Section 2, the inhabitants of Whitechapel. So who actually lived in this environment? Simply put, people with no other choice. Residents were largely trapped in irregular, seasonal dock work or incredibly low-paid sweated labor like tailoring. But the absolute most important exam takeaway on this slide is the extreme transience of the population. Thousands of people lived in doss houses. These were cheap lodging houses where a single bed could literally be rented for a few pence to 3 different people in a single day, working in shifts. Because of this shifting, anonymous population, there was a severe lack of community stability. I mean, if neighbors don't even know each other's names, the police have absolutely no way to build the essential local trust they need to do their jobs. And this instability was heavily compounded by massive migration waves. You had already established Irish settlers, and then, particularly in the 1880s, you saw a huge influx of Jewish migrants fleeing violent pogroms in Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire. Historically speaking, this rapid population shift led to severe local tensions. Migrants faced intense prejudice, and unfortunately, they were often unfairly scapegoated for the area's soaring crime rates and ongoing economic struggles. Moving on to Section 3, the organization of policing. The unfortunate men who were tasked with maintaining order in this environment fell under the jurisdiction of H Division of the Metropolitan Police. The typical Victorian beat constable had a really tough gig. He had to walk a fixed, localized route known as the beat, spotting trouble and keeping the peace. And he had to do this largely alone, on foot, armed with little more than a wooden truncheon, a whistle to call for backup, and a bullseye lantern to see in the dark. Now, considering the environment we just talked about, I want you to ask yourself a question. Why was H Division's job so exceptionally difficult? Why was standard Victorian policing completely failing in Whitechapel? Well, it's because the environment itself was their biggest adversary. Just look at this massive range of daily disorders they were up against. Officers were navigating unmapped, maze-like alleys that even the locals got lost in. They faced a highly uncooperative, transient population who didn't trust them. They were dealing with rampant alcohol abuse fueled by endless corner pubs, widespread prostitution, local gang protection rackets, and on top of the whole shebang, attempting to quell anti-Semitic violence. The police were, quite simply, outmatched by both the geography and the crushing poverty. Section 4. Investigative Policing and the Jack the Ripper Case. That perfect storm of impossible policing conditions led directly to the famous failures of the 1888 murders. For your exam, you really need to understand the severe limitations of early Victorian detective work. First off, there was a structural nightmare. Whitechapel sat right on the boundary between two completely separate police forces, the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police. So when Catherine Eddowes was murdered just over the boundary line into the City of London's jurisdiction, this split responsibility severely hampered the investigation and basically prevented any fluid communication. It was a jurisdictional mess. Furthermore, detectives back then lacked any kind of modern forensics. No fingerprinting, no DNA, no computer databases, nothing. They relied almost entirely on sketches and eyewitnesses, and they were actively hindered by things like the famous Dear Boss letter you see here. This letter, which was signed Jack the Ripper, is actually where the infamous name comes from. But historians largely agree today that it was a hoax, probably penned by an opportunistic journalist trying to sell papers. These kinds of false leads absolutely flooded Scotland Yard, wasting invaluable detective time. And the press? They absolutely fed the fire. Sensationalist, lurid reporting from outlets like the Illustrated Police News fueled massive, widespread public panic. It transformed a local tragedy into a huge national spectacle, putting intense, unprecedented, and ultimately unbearable pressure on the police to make an arrest. As the murders continued without anyone being caught, public confidence completely collapsed. The media's view is perfectly exemplified by this blind man's buff cartoon in Punch magazine. They basically viewed the Metropolitan Police as completely incompetent, blindly stumbling around in the dark and failing to protect the streets while criminals just mocked them. All this immense pressure led to some highly controversial decisions on the ground. Take a look at this image of Goulston Street. After Catherine Eddowes was murdered, a bloody piece of her apron was found right here, beneath a chalked anti-Jewish message on the wall. Fearing the message would spark massive anti-Semitic riots in an already incredibly tense neighborhood, Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren made a massive call. He ordered the graffiti washed away before it could even be photographed. He prioritized public order, sure, but in doing so, he effectively destroyed critical evidence. At a certain point, the locals felt so utterly abandoned by the police that they actually took matters into their own hands. Frustrated residents formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, led by a local builder named George Lusk. They literally patrolled the streets at night themselves, hired private detectives, and offered their own reward money. They ran a parallel investigation because they simply no longer trusted H Division to get the job done. Let's zoom out a bit for Section 5, the national and regional context. You see, the Whitechapel case wasn't just a local tragedy. It shone a glaring national spotlight on major systemic policing issues across Britain. The police were already struggling heavily with recruitment due to poor pay and harsh working conditions. On top of that, the CID, the Criminal Investigation Department, was still highly experimental. They were literally just figuring out how to actually be detectives. The political pressure surrounding this case became so intense that it forced the resignation of Sir Charles Warren himself, but crucially, this highly visible police failure acted as a major catalyst. It pushed the development and the structural reform of modern detective policing. It was a real wake-up call. Finally, Section 6, working with historical sources. Okay, listen up, because this is where you earn your marks. The true test of your GCSE exam is your ability to work with historical sources like a real historian. You must explicitly apply these 3 steps to every single source you encounter on exam day. Step 1. Who created it and why? A police report aims for official, factual accuracy, while a newspaper aims to sell copies through sensationalism, right? Step 2. What does it tell you, and just as importantly, what does it not tell you? A Punch cartoon tells you a lot about public opinion, but it tells you absolutely nothing about the actual facts of a crime scene. And Step 3. Is it useful for the specific enquiry? A source might be highly accurate, but completely useless for answering the exact question they're asking you on your exam paper. The documents we've examined today in this explainer, Booth's poverty map, the Punch cartoon, the hoax letter, these are exactly the types of sources you must master. So I leave you with this provocative thought. If a Victorian detective couldn't separate the media sensationalism from the cold hard facts, can you? Master these sources, trust the structure we walk through today, and you will absolutely crush this exam. Keep studying hard, and thanks for joining me.